Do you remember public space?
Oh my God, I'm a freaking drag queen. Of course I remember public space. I'll tell you, one of the things I miss the most is just getting on a plane and going to Austin International Drag Festival every year. Like the last 2 years, we've had, these really cool virtual festivals, but man, I just want to be able to touch and hug and hang out and have fun with all my friends from all over the world. I'll tell you what else I miss is just a sweaty, dirty, filthy, nasty, hole-in-the-wall punk rock club where I can just press my way through a throng of like 60 or 70 people jammed into a space that's big enough for maybe 15, 20 people, and then, find my way to the stage only to kind of press back out to collect their sweaty, filthy tips that I lovingly take home. Everything has been so different, and I just can't wait for things to be different this summer.
I really hope things are different this summer, and I really, really miss being in a dance club with, a bunch of sweaty people dancing to house music on the floors.
Sometimes shirtless and...
What? Shirtless and...
club kids in the corners with their glow sticks and flags waving around.
I really miss that. And I also miss all kinds of summer festivals and things that we do with tons of people that we've never met before, whether we're talking about concerts or pride festivals or whatever, just being able to be outside and see people's faces, not in masks. And so I'm really hoping this summer that we're able to get back to some kind of public space, normalcy, to enjoy the weather, each other. And so I'm hoping also that this summer, you're going to be able to join us in Northeast Ohio for a celebration of public art.
So we're your hosts. I'm Dr. Lady J.
And I'm Kenyon Farrow.
And welcome to the Pod of Dust and Rainbows,
which is named after the 2022 edition of the FRONT Triennial, O Gods of Dust and Rainbows.
Which is itself named after a 1957 couplet from Langston Hughes that says, quote, "O God of dust and rainbows, help us see that without the dust, the rainbows would not be."
So we're here to look at the rainbows, but also look into the rainbows and see the dust.
And to talk about it.
That's right. We're here to talk about it. This is the first episode, so we're going to start with the basics, like what is a triennial? I asked Front's executive director, Fred Bidwell, that question and went right to the source.
What on earth is a triennial? We usually hear about, bicentennial, centennials. Triennial may be a new phrase for some listeners. So tell us what a triennial is.
Well, technically a triennial is anything that happens every 3 years. But it's come to mean in the art world an art exhibition that happens every 3 years.
Okay, so there you have it. A big art show that happens every 3 years. Another way to tell you what a triennial is to tell you what it does.
So let me break it down for you. What a triennial does in the most simple terms is it puts contemporary art, that's art that's made right now about things we're going through right this minute, in public. Unlike in an art gallery or at an art fair, the art, it's not for sale. And unlike in a museum, the art isn't being collected and stored for perpetuity. It's just being shown for a brief period of time, just a snapshot. In Front's case, that's from July 16th to October 2nd, 2022. So a triennial is basically a free public art festival that happens every 3 years. And Front is going to happen this summer right here in Northeast Ohio.
And then if you take it one step further and ask what putting art in public does, that's where things start to get complicated and interesting. So to start things off, we're going to take a trip to Africa, Ohio. Yes, you heard that right.
There was a place in Delaware County, Ohio called Africa.
Wait, what?
There was a town in Delaware County, Ohio called Africa.
Say more.
Well, what I think is I happened to see it when I was doing my trip. I was in Delaware County, and I'm staying in Delaware County in some hotel. It was raining really hard, and I'm looking at the map and where am I going to go the next day? And I saw this thing on a Google map. It just said Africa, and I was like, "What? What in Delaware County, Ohio? What?" And so I went looking for it. It's part of the book I wrote, and it was a town. I think it got its name from the fact that Black people were moving through there. It got its name from white people who didn't want Black people around. And it was an active town probably mid-19th century, and then sort of disappeared shortly thereafter. There's a reservoir in Delaware County, and I think Africa was under what was now that reservoir. And so you see a sign. There's a commemorative sign by the reservoir. It took me 4 hours to find it.
As Stephen Nelson, who is currently Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., mentions, he was working on his upcoming book about the Underground Railroad, so 4 hours looking for the Africa, Ohio commemorative sign could be seen as a kind of dogged academic research. But my hunch is it was something else, too. The notion of a place called Africa, Ohio is startling because there are so few markers of Black history, so few places named after our experiences and accomplishments. We are used to places being called London or Dublin or Athens, but Africa? Africa as a place name in Ohio stands out and is honestly kind of startling because it gives us a glimpse of what is missing. I went to college at Ohio Wesleyan University in Delaware County, Ohio, and studied theater there and had never heard of Africa, Ohio, even though it's just up the road. As soon as Stephen Nelson mentioned it, I started thinking of going there. My mind was going there. And I've been going there on Instagram, too. In a way, the story I'm going to tell you is a way of getting to Africa, Ohio.
Part 1. Introducing Dawoud Bey.
This story is about a photographer you may have heard of, Dawoud Bey. For decades, Dawoud Bey has been recognized as one of the most important portrait photographers working in the United States. First introduced to Bey's work by a friend in high school who was into photography, I spent many hours with her in the dark room at Hawkins School developing photographs and looking through books of collected works. And I'm sure this is where I first saw Bey's photos of Harlem residents in the 1970s, and that attracted me. If you don't know his work at all, this might be a good time to press pause and do research for some of his amazing portraits, which are so full of life and movement, it's almost as if they're not pictures, but seem as though they're moving images. And I'm obviously not the only one who values this work. Dawoud Bey won the prestigious MacArthur Genius Grant in 2017, and over the last few years alone, he's had major exhibitions at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Art Institute of Chicago, among many other venues. Summarizing his practice for the 2021 retrospective, Dawoud Bey, An American Project, which was shown at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, and the High Museum in Atlanta, the curators put it this way. Bey chronicles communities and histories that have largely been underrepresented or even unseen, and his work lends renewed urgency to an enduring conversation about what it means to represent America with the camera.
Part 2, where Kenyon tells us how Dawoud Bey gets invited to be a part of the first FRONT Triennial in 2018, giving us a behind-the-scenes look at how an artist gets to be involved in a big show like this.
The artist Michelle Grabner had known Bey for many years, since they had both been teaching in Chicago. Grabner teaches painting at the School of the Art Institute, and Bey teaches photography a couple of blocks south on Michigan Avenue at Columbia College. Grabner had included Bay when she curated the 2014 Whitney Biennial. Bay had taken a photograph of Barack Obama as part of a fundraiser when Obama was running for Senate. And in 2014, Grabner wanted to use that photo as a historical marker and give it particular prominence in her show.
So when you got off the elevator on the fourth floor, you would see not only the text that introduced my ideas and the artist selection, but also juxtaposed with the wall text was the portrait by Dawoud of then President Obama.
Bay's work also marked history in other ways at the 2014 Whitney Biennial because Grabner also included a number of photographs from Bay's most recent work at the time, the Birmingham Project, a haunting meditation on the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing of September 15th, 1963. 4 Black girls, Addie Mae Collins, age 14, Cynthia Wesley, age 14, Carol Robertson, age 14, and Carol Dennis McNair, age 11, were killed in the church itself, and 2 Black boys, Johnny Robinson, age 16, and Virgil Ware, age 13, were both shot in the violence that followed. Bay's photographic response, which was initially exhibited at the Birmingham Museum of Art in 2013, consists of a series of photographs that pair the portrait of a child the same age as one of the bombing victims with an adult who, after 50 years have passed, is now the same age that the child would have been. The photographs are, like all photos, instantaneous records of that single moment when the shutter clicks. But the gap between the 2 subjects contains, by implication, the painful history of the 5 decades that separate them. More provocative than a straight commemoration, these pictures force us to reckon with the questions of loss and healing, personal and national, within the Birmingham community and within the African American community beyond Birmingham that result from this kind of violence. And the fact that the children are pictured pushes our minds into the future too. Where will they be in 50 more years? Where will we be as a country in 50 more years? When Grabner was chosen to curate the inaugural FRONT Triennial in 2018, she knew she wanted to work with Bay again. The title for her exhibition was An American City, and Grabner, who lives in Milwaukee, told me that she was interested in Cleveland as another Midwestern bellwether city, a place that tells you where the country is headed. Admiring Bay's decades of work as a chronicler of the everyday people in situ and his sensitivity to inflection points of American history, Grabner told me that she was excited to work with him again, especially because for FRONT, she could commission new work from him that related specifically to Cleveland, an American city, a bellwether. For his part, Bay told me he wanted to be sure to keep working on the questions of African American history he had begun to take up in the Birmingham Project.
Work was not entirely about the subjects in the photograph as much as who and what those people represented. A significant conceptual shift for me in that work. When I was invited by FRONT to do work for the FRONT Triennial, I knew I wanted to continue working with this idea of visualizing the African American past in the contemporary moment. When I have an idea, I like to be able to continue to think through those ideas rather than using an invitation to participate in something like FRONT as an opportunity to, for me, get knocked off course. I would be willing to participate if I could find an historical anchor there in Cleveland that would allow me to think through my working with history and figuring out how to visualize the historical moment in the contemporary moment. And my research quickly turned up the significance of Cleveland and northeastern Ohio in relation to the Underground Railroad. Once I had that, I gave them a firm yes. I said, I definitely want to participate in this. And I have an idea.
Part 3, where we learn how Dawoud Bey's initial idea to make art about the Underground Railroad finds its grounding at St. John's Church in Cleveland.
Bey knew he wanted to make work about the Underground Railroad, but that's not an easy story to tell. Here's Stephen Nelson again talking about why that is.
And I went all the way from Mobile, Alabama, up into St. Catharines, Ontario, where Harriet Tubman lived for a while. And people would say, if they were from anywhere east of the Mississippi, they would say things like, oh, there's an Underground Railroad house in my hometown.
The Underground Railroad itself was vast, but the myth has made it even bigger.
And if there's one story that everyone in the United States seems to want to cling to, it's the Underground Railroad.
And as Professor Nelson put it to me, that's because the Underground Railroad is a way to structure both Black and white people's identity in the United States. Some points of the Underground Railroad are marked. For white people in the North, these plaques might even be a point of pride, a way to connect with abolition and perhaps with some kind of absolution. For Black people too, there's a sense of reflected pride, but there's also much more. In many ways, these spaces mark less of victory than a protracted reign of terror that, in the grand scheme of things, only a relatively small number of Black people were able to even attempt to utilize, given their near total control of their physical movement, whether enslaved or free, which was in place throughout much of the history of chattel slavery in America. And while major protests have happened to remove monuments and street names of the perpetrators and enablers of slavery and anti-Black violence, the relative invisibility of the violence and resistance to chattel slavery reminds me how much of public space that relates to our history remains unmarked. I'm going to ask you to do a little experiment. Take a moment and write down the name of the town you live in, the street you grew up on, and the high school you went to. For example, I live in Cleveland Heights. I grew up on Kinsman in Cleveland and went to Hawken for high school. If you don't know already, take a minute to research what that place is named after. How do you relate to these names? Do you connect to them? Chances are it's a Native American place name, Cincinnati, Chillicothe, Ashtabula, or even Cuyahoga. Or it's named after a place in Europe, Dublin, Toledo, Athens. Or it's named after someone from Europe, like Columbus. African Americans have played a huge role in Ohio's history, but as far as public space goes, we are largely left out of the story. That's why I was shocked to hear about Africa, Ohio. Even in the city of Cleveland, a majority Black city, that history is elusive at best. The fact that St. John's Church on the city's west side, for example, was the last stop on the Underground Railroad, and there's a historical marker in front of it, but until Bey's exhibit, I had no knowledge of this church and its history. So yes, the points on the Underground Railroad are marked, but the points in between are not. And just as with the Birmingham Project, Bey found a way to picture the points in between.
Part 4, how St. John's Church helps Dawoud Bey make his now famous series of very dark, very evocative photographs. Night Coming Tenderly Black.
St. John's Church in the Ohio City neighborhood on Cleveland's west side, was a last stop on the Underground Railroad. From there, people escaping slavery would get a signal about when it was safe to go to Lake Erie and cross into Canada to freedom. As Michelle Grabner put it,
it really was introducing the site of St. John's Church to Dawoud, in which he then started to think expansively about photography, about narrative, about history, this very specific history that you're talking about, St. John's being a place for fugitive slaves before they would cross over Lake Erie into Canada.
For Dawoud Bey, it became a gathering point for his research.
With FRONT, I had the absolutely unique opportunity to situate that work in a place, St. John's Episcopal Church, which was an actual site of that history. You know, the church where the work was installed was actually the last stop that fugitive escaping enslaved people would make while they waited for the signal from Lake Erie that it was safe to go the last few miles.
What emerged from the encounter with St. John's Church and thinking about Ohio's role in the Underground Railroad was a continuation of Bey's meditations on Black history, but it was also a startling departure. The project he made for FRONT 2018 was called Night Coming Tenderly Black, named after Langston Hughes' line, "Night coming tenderly, black like me." As Bey put it to me,
this idea Langston Hughes described, night coming tenderly, this beautiful blackness, this tender blackness through which the Black subject moved, became one of the conceptual anchors of the work.
looking into the Blackness of those photos, it's hard to describe them. They're black and whites ostensibly, but they're actually just so richly Black with landscapes, images of fields and fences behind houses, almost as if the viewer is looking from the vantage point of an escaped slave, marking territory, marking time, marking the weather, making their way from place to place through a dark night landscape.
It was the first time that I began to explore more deeply the narrative of place, the narrative of space itself. Ironically, for me, the figure, the subject, does not entirely disappear from that work to the extent that people have thought, because to my mind, the gaze into the landscape of the Night Coming Tenderly photograph, is actually from and through the eyes of the escaping, formerly enslaved persons making their way through that landscape.
So it's almost hard to imagine now in 2022 what it would be like to be a person fleeing from bondage, making one's way across often hundreds of miles from one place to another, looking just at houses, at maybe markings that were left by other people who had escaped slavery or who attempted to help other people escape slavery, and really wondering if you were going to be safe as you moved north, following nothing but the moon, the stars, and potential landscapes as markers for which way to go.
So the figure hasn't completely disappeared. They're just not visible because we're seeing that landscape through their eyes. And I say that with all seriousness because that dictated where I placed the camera.
One of the most poignant places he put the camera was right by an open field.
When my assistant and I were driving through Hudson, Ohio, we passed an open field. And looking at that field through the context of fugitivity and imagining a fugitive, formerly enslaved person having to run across the vast openness of that field before they could get back into the forest. You know, I'm reading a narrative into these places, and the way that narrative can become a part of the larger narrative that I was constructing with the work, all the way back to Cleveland and Lake Erie, because obviously Lake Erie is the point where on this side that journey would end before making the passage to Canada.
And when Bay put the photographs into the church, everything came together. I'll let Michelle Grabner describe it for you.
Many individuals, many visitors would just sit at the pew amongst those suspended photographs, almost as in contemplation, understanding the role of the interior architecture and the photographs, kind of existing somewhere in between. So I would say that every individual that would enter the space acknowledged the photographs, acknowledged the arc and the range and the movement that those photographs represented, but then would come to rest at this really beautiful moment in which those photographs punctuated that space. And it was somewhere they would hover between the photographs and the space itself.
Bay is of a generation of Black artists whose mission was to bring their view of the African-American experience into the white-walled gallery and museum spaces that have historically excluded that vision. So he wasn't exactly meaning to put his work in a church, but once he tried it, he felt the power of it.
Having the work installed there, which I have to say was not my idea. And when it was first presented to me, I wasn't sure. Because I'm used to functioning in the world of white walls. I like to say, and I tell them, at the time, I make work that goes inside of white wall spaces, but they're not white wall photographs. It's about disrupting that white wall space. This was a more site-specific opportunity that ultimately gave the work even more resonance.
It's hard to summarize that resonance, but I think it has to do with how these photos mark public space. As I talked about before, there are so few markers and monuments of the African-American experience in America. Churches are certainly among those few markers, and since we don't have states, cities, or many streets named for African Americans, with the exception of the occasional Martin Luther King Boulevard in city to city, the churches are among the most prominent public markers of our history. And of course, the Underground Railroad stops are marked and acknowledged where they're known. So St. John's Church is both. But Bay made this even more powerful because he thought about all of the infinite unmarked stops on the railroad, gathered them together by putting his photos in the church at the final stop. Like the sign for Africa, Ohio, the photographs were perhaps a small marker of something enormous, a time travel vision of what it meant to escape from slavery and what it still means to seek liberation. In the churches, perhaps, but also in the regular open fields and small towns of Ohio. When I talked to Stephen Nelson, he had this to say about it.
It is evocative. It is about absence, and it is about taking flight. And so, if you think about the title, Night Coming Tenderly Black, which is from a Langston Hughes poem of 1926, from his Dream Variations, that the poem itself is about the moment at which we as Black people can basically remove ourselves from the white gaze, right? And the photographs do the same kind of thing. They try to imagine a world without a white gaze, right? Where we can just be ourselves, where we can just sort of do whatever it is we do. And, in taking people out of the equation, and that's a big move in Bay's work. It's not the first time he's done it. And so there are other pictures from earlier in his career that look at cityscapes and the like, where they're not the portraits that we've come to know and love. But it is about absence, it's about taking flight, it's about removal. But I also think that it's about the importance of the Underground Railroad today.
Part 5, where we learn what happens after Night Coming Tenderly Black was shown at Front.
After Front, Night Coming Tenderly Black left the church space and has been touring museums in the United States, including the Art Institute of Chicago, where Bay told me he tried to bring back some of the environment that was supporting the work at St. John's Church.
I was a little bit uncomfortable with what you might call a completely white box sanitized presentation after the site-specific presentation at Front. And so I commissioned a friend of mine, a vocalist and musicologist and composer, Imani Uzuri, whose performance and research, I asked her if she would do a performance in the space in the Art Institute, not in the auditorium, but in the gallery where the photographs were. Because since the work had come out of the church, I wanted to bring the church and that Black, musicology context back to the work.
At Front, there was a connection between public space and a public concern, which I actually think is very rare.
But I think those who had the opportunity to see the work as it was installed at Front had a very unique opportunity.
It was a unique opportunity, like seeing the sign for Africa, Ohio. A moment where a long buried history, something that is so vast and deep that it can be hard to fathom, pokes through the light of the everyday. Bay's photos are powerful portals, giving us an imaginary glimpse into a past moment while also bringing us into a present that is grounded in history as it actually occurred. Slavery actually occurred, and many risked their lives for liberation along the Underground Railroad. Africa, Ohio was an actual place. A lot of people would rather not think about all of that, bury that history. Even if you want to think about it, it's hard to bring it back in a way that carries the real spirit and the essence of what actually happened. What must liberation from slavery have been like? To wait for the light that tells you it's safe to cross the lake and be free. Or to have no signal at all as you wait for the right moment to cross an open field. What was that like? Night Coming Tenderly Black, these dark, dark photos, give us a way to think about all of that, to put our minds there for a minute. Tenderly.
Stay tuned for episode 2, where we will continue exploring the theme of public space as we dive into the work of tufted textile artist Lorraine Lynn. So until next time, I'm Dr. Lady J.
And I'm Kenyon Farrow.
And we hope all your dust turns to rainbows. The Pod of Dust and Rainbows has been made to accompany the 2022 edition of FRONT International, the Cleveland Triennial for Contemporary Art. The show is hosted and produced by me, Lady J, and Kenyon Farrow. Recorded at the Studio West 117 and West 117 Foundation Podcast Studio. Dushko Petrovich Cordova is our executive producer, Naomi Kolumna is our sound designer, and our theme music is by Elephant Ornament. We'd also like to thank Front's executive director, Fred Bidwell, deputy director Sarah Spinner-Liska, and project manager Allison Smith for all their help. This project was made possible with generous support from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. Thanks again to all our guests on this episode and to you for listening. This episode can be found on the Front website at www.frontart.org/event/podcast-1.